Thank you. Hey, I want to especially thank the ladies of Goodman Dorm, all right, for their opening video. It fits right in with our theme today of a God of humor. All right, so thank you, ladies. That was excellent. Man, very good. A vision of God, a God of humor. One of the things I discovered is that some things are just almost impossible to put into words. For example, just the concept of laughter. If you had to explain laughter to a little green man from Mars who had no idea what it was, what would you say? Well, hey, here at Ozark, we're big on research. So I went to the dictionary, and here is the definition of laughter. Laughter is an abrupt, strong expiration followed by a series of expiratory, inspiratory microcycles superimposed over the longer expiratory movements, end of quote. Oh, that really helps a lot, doesn't it? Yeah, that's what laughter is. I thought, well, all right, dictionary didn't do it. Let me go to the trusty thesaurus. Now, some of these words that are synonyms for laughter actually kind of did make me laugh. I mean, laughter is chuckle, chortle, guffaw, giggle, titter, snigger, roar, hoot, tee-hee, ha-ha. Well, not really all that much help either, is it? So I've come to the conclusion through this research, sometimes you can't explain something, you've just got to experience it. Are you guys familiar with Jeff Foxworthy? And, you might be a redneck if. You like those? All right, change it a little bit. This is not redneck, but you might be a preacher if. You might be a preacher if you've ever fantasized about rebaptizing a deacon. You might be a preacher if you would rather negotiate with a terrorist than the church organist. You might be a preacher if you've ever wanted to give the sound man a little feedback of your own. You might be a preacher if you've ever had to explain that catechism is not a feline medical procedure. You might be a preacher if you use the word holy more times than Batman and Robin. You might be a preacher if you've ever had to explain that the epistles are not the wives of the apostles. Children were lined up Christian school cafeteria getting ready for lunch. At the head of the table was this large pile of apples. The cafeteria lady put a note there by those apples, and she said, "Take only one. God is watching." Moving through the line, the other end of the table is a pile of chocolate chip cookies. One little boy took out a piece of paper, he wrote his own note, he put it down there, and it said, "Take all the cookies you want, boys. God's watching the apples." Man was walking along the California beach. He was deep in prayer. And all of a sudden, he hears out loud this booming voice from heaven. And it says, "Son, you've been a faithful follower of mine. Today, I am going to grant you one wish. What would you want?" And the man said, "Build a bridge to Hawaii so that I could drive over there anytime I wanted." And the Lord answered, "I'm kind of disappointed. I mean, that request, that's very materialistic. I mean, think of the logistics that's involved in that kind of undertaking. Do you know how deep the Pacific Ocean is? Do you know how long those girders would have to be? How much concrete? How many weigh stations? How many side things? I mean, I could do it, but that's really hard for me to justify your desire for that kind of a worldly thing. Wouldn't you rather take some more time and think of a wish that would really more honor me and benefit mankind? The man thought for a while, and he finally said, okay, Lord, I wish that I could understand women. I want to know what they feel inside, what they're thinking when they give me the silent treatment, why they cry, and what they really mean when they say nothing. And how can I make a woman truly happy? There's silence for a long time, and then God finally said, how many lanes do you want on that bridge? Well, let's look at the history first of humor in the church. Throughout church history, Christians actually have swung on a pendulum, depending upon which period in church history you're looking at, how they felt about the use of humor and participating in humorous things. The early church, because of its struggle with the Greek and Roman paganism, they tended to associate laughter and humor with pagan frivolity, with the Colosseum, and with this hedonistic philosophy of life, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And so the church fathers were determined that no, we need to separate ourselves from that kind of hollow hilarity that the world seeks after. And so Chrysostom, one of the early church fathers, said this. He says, quote, "This world is not a theater in which we can laugh. We are not assembled together in order to burst into peals of laughter, but to weep for our sins." And that's followed up by the rise and the popularity of religious asceticism. Asceticism is that discipline for piety and seeking after religious virtue where you become, in their idea, more holy by absolutely denying the desires of the flesh and anything that is comfortable, fun, or enjoyable. And so by the 2nd century, asceticism really was the chief influence over Christianity. And so it was commonly just held that the ascetic denial, the mortification of the body, the denial of anything that's comfortable, fun, or enjoyable, if you can deny those things and curb any of your appetites, that's going to make you a more holy person than those who participate in fun and laughter in this world. And I think a possible reason for the neglect of humor, even in the United States, is the strong influence of Puritanism. Now, Puritanism did make some very valuable and constructive contributions to life and character in America. But I think it devoted itself so passionately towards the God of holiness, they neglected to find in the Bible the God of humor. I mean, from the Puritan standpoint, this is really serious business to overcome the world and the flesh and the devil. I mean, it's such a serious thing. There's little room for laughter and fun. So the Puritan spiritual heirs carried this even further. Misery became the thermometer of holiness. And so the more miserable you were, the more holy you were. Oh, if God demands things of men and women, the more holy, the more harder it is to do, and the least you'd want to do it. The more somber and distasteful something is, the more holy it probably is. Now, unfortunately, that influence of kind of the early church, of religious asceticism and Puritanism, caused a lot of people just to divorce themselves from association with the church. And I think it's because they've reacted against a false view of God and of Christianity. Because at its finest, Christianity should fill someone who's a follower of Christ with a fundamental joy. It should put a song on your lips and hope in your heart spring in your step. Does God have a sense of humor? I mean, some people actually wondered whether God does have a sense of humor. My wife settled that. She says, of course God has a sense of humor. He made men and women so different and then told them to go live together. All right. We read in Genesis 2 and 3 that God created us in His image. Psalm 2:4 says, the one enthroned in heaven laughs. And surely God has ordained laughter for the human experience. As much as He has ordained sorrow, He's ordained fun as much as seriousness. I mean, we read in Ecclesiastes 3:4, there is a time to weep and a time to laugh. Now, even though I think that laughter and humor, even the ability to understand humor, it's a reflection of part of our being created in the image of God, that laughter and humor are not always a clear reflection of God. Because laughter, just like everything else, I think it became corrupted by the fall. And so laughter can be a negative, derisive thing. I mean, we can actually laugh at people in a scornful way. Both Job and Jeremiah complained to God that they had become laughingstocks. Jewish nation complained to God that their enemies laughed at their distress. Fallen laughter moves in a direction and a spirit that is the opposite of divine laughter. Godless humor can be arrogant, taunting, scornful, contemptuous, sneering, vulgar, cruel, bitter, and insane. I think the picture says it all, doesn't it? So, because of these possibilities, I think it's easy for some to see all humor as pagan, a thing to be avoided. But I think instead, as Christians, what God would have us to do is simply learn how to discern what's appropriate and inappropriate humor. Because humor actually has a very special place in the Abraham narratives. Genesis 17 and 18. God gives this promise to Abraham. I mean, remember, Abraham and Sarah, they had tried on their own for many, many years to produce a son. But because Sarah was barren, she tells Abraham, tell you what, let's go to plan B. You sleep with my maidservant Hagar, you produce a son through her, and, that'll be good. So Hagar gets pregnant, gives birth to Ishmael. The plan worked. Sort of. But God had a better plan, a bigger plan, a miraculous plan. And in chapter 17:16, God says to Abraham, I will bless Sarah, and I will give you a son by her. And when Abraham hears that, you know what his response is? Verse 17 says, he fell down on his face and he laughed. And he says to himself, shall a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who's nearly 90 years old, bear a child? That's a good one, God. I like your sense of humor. Think about how you'd react if you're very old and you're told to expect a stork to show up at your door. You'd probably laugh too. I mean, falling down on one's face is an attitude of worship, but Abraham falls down, and not only does he worship, but he laughs. He has a good laugh because he sees the funny side of God's promise. So Abraham's rolling in the aisle. His laughter is this response to God's unbelievable but incredible promise of a son, and a son that's going to be born to his wrinkled old wife. Now, can you imagine what kind of news it would be today if you took a 90-year-old woman, that's Betty White, And a 99-year-old man, that's George Burns, and he was 99, all right? You give them a wedding, and 9 months later, the stork drops a little bundle of joy right in their laps. I mean, if that happened, I'm guaranteeing you there would be appearances immediately on Good Morning America. Oprah would reopen her station, all right? We got to interview these people. This couple would receive free Pampers for life, you know, probably for the whole family by then, all right? I mean, the washing machine companies, the baby food companies, the toy companies, I mean, everyone's going to be lining up at their door just to give them free stuff so they could use it for the advertising. I mean, what a remarkable happening that would be. So Abraham laughed. He didn't plan to laugh. He didn't think it over first. It just popped right out of him right there in front of God and everybody. He just laughed. Now, in chapter 18, Sarah, like Abraham, she also laughs at this unbelievable promise of bearing a son. In chapter 18, it says, "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" But Sarah had her doubts. She doubted the promise of God. She didn't think it could happen. I mean, Sarah's 90 years old, people. Her biological clock, man, it hasn't just run down. That baby's disintegrated, all right? Kaput, nothing. I mean, it seems so absurd that she would get pregnant in her 90s. Oh, are you kidding me? And so she laughs. Now, it is the very same Hebrew word for laughter that is used in chapter 17 of Abraham's laugh. But in chapter 18, God is not very happy with Sarah and her laughter. And so you have to ask, well, since it's the very same Hebrew word and Abraham's commended for his laughter, Sarah's condemned, why is that? Oh, I know why. Because all the patriarchs are a bunch of male-dominating chauvinistic pigs, that's why. All right. No, that's not it. That's not it. It wasn't just laughter. It was disbelief. And when we laugh in disbelief over what God has told us, we are really mocking God. We're mocking his promises. We're mocking his character. We're mocking his ability to do what he has promised that he would do. When God calls us to do something and we claim it's impossible, we're actually proclaiming our disbelief in his power and his sovereignty over this world. God hears Sarah's laughter, and he addresses the situation. The Lord says to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh when I said, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old?" God understands that Sarah is not laughing because she's delighted with what the Lord says. She's laughing because she believes it's impossible. And God's response to Sarah is, "Sarah, your God is too small." And he asked her this rhetorical question, "Sarah, is anything too hard for the Lord?" And the expected answer is no. The God who created the universe with just the word from his mouth is not limited by the world that he created. So what seemed impossible for Sarah, from her standpoint, wasn't impossible for God at all. Now, we know the ending. Because Sarah did, as we well know, conceive and bear the very son that God promised, and she named him Itzhak, which means laughter in Hebrew. And she says, "God has made me laugh, And all who hear this story about a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old lady having a baby, they're going to laugh. And now Sarah laughs with joy, knowing that God had enabled her to achieve the apparently unachievable. What do we learn from that? What's the place of humor for the Christian today? I think there's a real serious message in the midst of the humor. You see the importance of this passage for our everyday living? God is saying something to us when we are in a situation that we think is impossible. Are you facing infertility? Is your problem really too hard for the Lord? You've got an overwhelming illness. You don't believe that God can meet your needs? Or you're trying to raise support to get to the mission field, and because of the economy, you're told that churches are actually cutting back on support, so you give it up. You don't think that the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills can supply your need? Those who face old wounds, hurts that you just can't seem to overcome, is that really, guys, beyond God's ability to heal? Those of you who've been raised in dysfunctional homes, you don't think that God can unravel all that mess and heal the pain? Those who look at the task of paying for their college education, they go, forget it, man. I've taken out so many student loans, it's impossible. You really think it's impossible for the God of this universe? And those who feel their marriage is just hopelessly over, the God who made you one can also renew that love. And the list could go on, guys. I think I've given you enough examples. You get the picture. The simple laughter of Abraham and Sarah reminds us that we often laugh when we should trust. We throw our hands up in the air when we should put our hands together in prayer. We're too prone to focus on our lack of strength instead of the one who has sufficient strength. Now, the response of the early church to the empty frivolity of the Greeks and the Romans and the Puritans in the early days of America, it caused a lot of people just to divorce themselves from association of humor in the church. But in the Middle Ages, the church actually utilized laughter and comedy in response of a celebration of victory at Easter. In fact, Easter hymns have affirmed the victory of life by basically laughing at the face of death. Easter sermons during the Middle Ages, they would begin with, and they were supposed to contain jokes. And telling jokes inside and outside of the church at family gatherings on Easter was common practice. Because the basis of all the joke telling was simply this: at Easter, God pulled off the biggest cosmic joke ever because he had the last laugh. Because Satan thought that he had won when he crucified the Lord of glory. But come Easter morning when Jesus rose from the dead, God's just going to devil, nah. In your face, evil one. That's the best joke ever. Professor of the Old Testament remarked one day, class, if you've never seen God smile, or if you've never heard him laugh, you don't know him very well. In fact, I think our understanding of God, it's expanded by our discovering in him and in ourselves this divine attribute of humor. Because humor can be uniting, it can be healing, and it can be life-affirming. Not only does humor provide insight into God's nature, but it's an avenue for God to heal. Laughter heals. And God gave us a capacity for laughter and humor. He provided a means to demonstrate his healing power to all creation. I think